My name's David Webley from Granite Consulting and Conversations with Thought Leaders. Just quick intro. We've been going for nearly 15 years as a business, and we've always done a lot of boardroom, professional development type events. Pandemic forced us, like so many, to do things differently. So we launched Conversations with Thought Leaders, which is podcast webinars. Christian was a guest on that show. Back then, it was just normally myself and Peter in here staring at a camera. So it's amazing to be able to do things back in person. And this is the next evolution of Conversations with Thought Leaders within the Granite Consulting series of events. So I hand over to my learned colleague, Sam, who's actually the gentleman who's made this happen today. So thank you, Sam. And over to you, mate.
No, thank you, Dave. And thank you all for coming as well. It's great to see so many of you here, especially so early in the morning. And I think Dave said as well, I want to say thank you to Seedling Cafe for catering the event. But look, really excited to have Christian return to do another session with us. He's a highly skilled technology leader with over 20 years of experience in the IT industry. Now as a Flutter expert, he's been at the forefront of developing cutting-edge applications for the past few years. And Christian's held numerous leadership roles throughout his career and has worked with some really notable organisations such as Toll Group, Infor, Telstra Health, MyOb. And it was about 3 years ago he started his own company specialising in Flutter, which has quickly become a successful provider of mobile app development services. And look, his extensive knowledge and experience, Christian's now sought after consultant and trusted advisor, not just here in Australia, but across the UK as well. So without further ado, really proud to welcome back Christian for his second event here with Conversation with Thought Leaders. So ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Christian Findlay.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks for the introduction. So I wanted to come and talk about Flutter. I've had a very long career working with mobile solutions. I first started working with mobile solutions in around 2010. I was working in the local government space. And in the local government space, they have a lot of issues with low connectivity, especially in Australia and New Zealand where I was working. So in that kind of space, there's a lot of room for apps with occasional connectivity and those kind of things. So I worked with that kind of technology over many years, and I watched quite a few developments. Most of the stuff that I always did was with Microsoft, mostly working with Xamarin back in the day and watching the evolution of Xamarin over time. But over the years, I've been watching to the space to see what other kinds of technologies came up. React Native is obviously one of the ones that have come up, and React Native is also an amazing technology, a very, very large community. But a few years ago, when I started getting interested in Flutter, I started to realize that Flutter is something very unique, very different. So that's why I've been talking to Sam about, and that's what I'm here to sort of chat about today. So the question we're going to start with, so the real question is, can we invest in a technology to reduce code maintenance costs? I think that's every manager's sort of aim, really, is how do we cut down the costs of developing apps? And throughout my time of developing apps with Xamarin, for the most part, Xamarin didn't solve all the problems, but at least it meant that we could develop for one single code base and run it across many different types of devices. And that's the aim of the game, really. So that's what cross-platform development's all about. So as you know, most businesses will have to target iOS and Android. You're probably going to have to build phone apps at some point. Most big businesses will have to build phone apps at some point. The current go-to for those things are native apps or maybe React Native. But we probably also need to deploy to the web and possibly for desktop. So when we're talking about web, we're usually going to go for something like React, maybe Angular for those things. we want to try and minimize the number of code bases that we have for the system. So if we are building for multiple platforms, we'd hope to have 2, maybe 3 code bases, but we'd hope to not have more than that. And ultimately, if we could have 1, that would be amazing. So introducing Flutter. So in many ways, Flutter does deal with this issue. It's a similar technology to React Native, also to Xamarin and other approaches. But I think, in my opinion, and my feeling from working with it, is that it has a lot of potential to go even further than other cross-platform toolkits. So it's an open source cross-platform UI toolkit created by Google. It was created from scratch by Google, and it runs on phones, desktops, and web browsers. They created the first prototype in 2015. The fully released software development kit was 2020, so it's still fairly new. It hasn't had a lot of time to mature, but it's very mature for the amount of time that it has been around. The first version with web support was 2021. Now, web is something to definitely think about with Flutter as well. Can Flutter web challenge React in any way? Maybe, maybe not. But moving into future, what we can see is we can see that Flutter apps will run on the web browser. They may not be as optimized as a React solution, but in some cases, your business may be able to leverage Flutter web. You can check out the links in the presentation later. There's a YouTube video here from the very early days of Flutter. And you can see the original aim from Google was to create a software development environment kit that's a better experience for users and a better experience for developers. Google obviously has spent a lot of time working with mobile development, web development, and they took their learning and created a new toolkit. They've been working with Java and Kotlin on their platform for Android, but they had a chance to create something fresh and their own, and something based on their learning, and that's what we see with Flutter. For people who are not familiar with cross-platform development, if we ask the question, what is it? Well, cross-platform development basically allows us to write single source code. So we write the app once, and then we run it on many different devices. There's separate challenges for each device, so iOS, Android, for desktop, web. Each platform comes with its own challenges, but as a basis, we have a lot of it covered with one single source code base in Flutter. And right now it supports Android, iOS, Linux, macOS, Windows, and web. So right out of the box, if you create a Flutter project at the moment, you have apps for all those different platforms, and you can run the app on each of those platforms, which is pretty spectacular, really. Google's also working on an operating system called Fuchsia. The future of that is not quite certain. That could become an alternative to Android moving into future. Google may treat Fuchsia as the operating system of choice. You may buy phones in future that are Google-based phones that are actually running Fuchsia. That operating system uses Flutter quite a bit at the moment. Google are investing heavily in using Flutter in the new operating system. So that means that quite possibly apps that Google produce now with Flutter will run on Android and on Fuchsia in future. So it may mean that in future, when you develop native apps for Fuchsia, you're developing them in Flutter. So there's a good chance that might happen, and I have a feeling that that may happen because Google is putting so much into making Flutter a great toolkit. So from the ground up, Flutter has had a focus on performance, and it compiles to native code. This is the difference between something like Xamarin or React Native. React Native these days has removed the bridge from what I understand, but in the early days it had a bridge between JavaScript and the native controls. That kind of slowed down the system from my understanding. Flutter compiles directly to the native platform. So when you write Dart code, Dart is the programming language that you use with Flutter. When you write Dart code, it compiles down directly with no intermediate process to the original platform code. That makes a big difference in terms of performance, and that's by design. So whatever platform that you compile for, you know that you're getting the best possible performance out of the code. They are also working on a new rendering engine called Impala. This is another important point. They don't necessarily get tied down with a particular rendering engine. A rendering engine is responsible for rendering the UI, rendering the graphics. It draws the pixels on the screen. They've had some issues with some animations on certain platforms in the past, but Google is not wedded to the particular rendering engine that they've had, and the new Impala engine that they're working on is even faster and even smoother in terms of animation than what they have. So moving into future, they should be able to leverage the Impala engine to render even smoother graphics and animation going into future. And I think they're going to deploy that on the web as well. So you get the top-notch animation engine running inside the browser that you would get on the desktop experience, which is pretty spectacular. We have to ask the question, what kind of big companies are using Flutter, and what kind of big projects have they done with Flutter? It's an important question to ask, because if you are a business, if you're a big business, you need to know that somebody else has walked down that path before and tried this out and made sure, test the waters, make sure that they actually have done the same thing. And you can check all of this out on the Flutter showcase. The Flutter website has a showcase section, and you can see the kind of companies that they're advertising. There's more here. BMW, Toyota, and Google. Google is obviously using Flutter quite heavily in a lot of ways, but these big companies are using Flutter and they're having success with Flutter. From what I checked out, the Flutter showcase is about the same size as the React Native showcase in terms of the companies that are using showcase. It looks very good, and that's only in a short amount of time. Flutter has only been, very popular for 3 years or so, whereas React Native has had more time. And it's looking more and more like large companies are getting on with Flutter and adopting Flutter. There's a particular app that I noticed, which is the Rive Animation Studio. Animation is obviously a very CPU and GPU intensive sort of environment to work on. And they chose Flutter as their desktop solution, which is really interesting because there are many, many different desktop toolkits that they could have picked, but they chose to go with Flutter because they can get the most out of the hardware, the computer hardware using Flutter, which really says something about the desktop offering in Flutter. It's not just best of breed in terms of mobile, it also brings the same technology to desktop. So the development experience is good right from the ground up on any of the platforms that you work on. It's not something where the development experience is great for mobile, but then languages behind on desktop. That's not the case with Flutter. So recently I worked for a company called Octopus Group, and they had 2 apps that were in the App Store, an iOS version and an Android version. They'd had issues in the past. They wanted to make some changes to the app, start upgrading the app, fix some issues that are there. The problem is they have to have 2 developers working or 1 person doing the app twice. This is just a common scenario. I think every business that has a mobile app with native apps would have experienced this. You've got one app in iOS, one app in Android. If you want to make a change, you have to make it in one, and then you have to make it in the other. And that change may look the same, or you may get things slightly wrong, and then the app starts to look different. And if perhaps you don't have the same person available to work on both, or that person left the business, then you might need to get somebody else in to work on the other version of the app. And suddenly what you see is that the apps go off in different directions. So in this case, I was able to take the app. It took about 2 months to take the existing app, convert it to Flutter, and right now, if they want to make a change, any changes that they need, I do it in one place, and then I deploy it to both stores. So it's a time saver, it's a money saver, and it also adds consistency to the app over time. When you look at the app on both platforms, it's the same. You're not looking at two different apps. You get to keep your branding, your look and feel across multiple devices. And I think that's another really big important point about Flutter as well. Your branding is important. So if you build an app and you have designers working on the app, you want to make sure that that design is transferred across both platforms. It's not enough for your branding and your design to work well on Android, but then when you take it to iOS, you get something different because the iOS developer did something a little bit different. Flutter keeps you in the same space for both platforms or all the platforms, and make sure that you get to keep your branding wherever you put your app. I had a case at some point where a company maintained two apps. Those apps involved money, transactions. The apps had rounding discrepancies. So there was a 1 cent rounding discrepancy between the two native apps. That's the kind of discrepancy you can get with an app, where it actually affects money. And that would not be an issue with Flutter because it uses the same code on both sides.
And maybe just to add to that as well. So you can have the apps look exactly the same on Android and iOS, but the sort of smaller components such as the data selector, other things like dialogues you can make them look exactly the way iOS dialogues and data selectors look. And for Android, the same there. So the app is virtually the same, except for those things that for an iOS user would be normal to scroll through the date, for instance, and for Android you would pick date. So those things can be made so that they look exactly the way native apps look, but everything else looks exactly the same. So that's...
Yeah, Flutter gives you a toolkit to make the app adaptive for the native OS. So you've got a sliding scale of how much you want to make the app look like the native platform. So you can add more and more of the native feel if you want, or you can back away from it. Even to the point where you can take native controls themselves. You can use the native platform's controls directly in your Flutter app and interact with them. So if you really want to bring the feel of the native operating system into your Flutter app, there's no issue with that. It doesn't fight you on that either. That's easy to achieve with Flutter. So I've always kind of worked with cross-platform toolkits, but I work with other toolkits as well, Windows-specific toolkits and lots of different toolkits. I started working with Flutter on a side project, and that really just started out as a Windows desktop app. The development experience was so good that I decided to keep going with Flutter as the toolkit. If you ask why I use Flutter, obviously the cross-platform aspect is huge because that's about getting the app to as many people as possible. But as a developer, I have to use a toolkit, and the Flutter toolkit is the best UI toolkit that I've ever worked with in terms of development. Everything about it feels polished. Everything about it is free. So it comes with debugging, profiling, memory profiling. It comes with all these tools out of the box. They don't charge for these things. They're not some locked away feature that come with a subscription. It's not something you have to pay for in the IDE. These are all things that just come out of the box with Flutter. it just felt to me like there was low friction, and everything I did with Flutter was a step forward and something that was easy to achieve, unlike the other toolkits that I've seen. As a developer, it makes me comfortable working with it, and I get results quickly. In terms of debugging and testing, right out of the box, as I mentioned, it comes with free tools for CPU profiling. The debugger is excellent and integrates with whatever IDE you choose. The main IDEs that I use are VS Code and Android Studio. The debugger integrates with those, and it has its own debugger as well. You can debug Flutter code without the IDE, which is a great tool. The testing toolkit that comes with Flutter is probably the best part of the entire ecosystem, in my opinion. I'm a pretty big advocate of automated testing. What Flutter comes with that most toolkits don't have is the ability to test the UI directly in the same way that you would test the UI with something like Selenium. So it has the kind of capacity to do something like Selenium, but it also has the ability to control the clock of the application so that you can run the tests very quickly. Something that might take 10 seconds to walk through in terms of a test in something like Selenium, you may be able to run that in a second on Flutter, because all of the processing gets condensed down into that period of time. So you can run complex UI interactions in the background, headless, like you would with a headless Selenium test or whatever, but in a much shorter time frame. That means that you can walk through the use cases of your application very easily. You can set the test to run up in the pipeline, and those tests will run within maybe 20, 30 seconds, very quickly, compared to something else that might take minutes to run for full automated tests. Any questions before we go on, or?
I had a question, like we were mentioning, obviously it's good to have cross-platform languages like Flutter, but let's say React Native and Flutter, and you need to make a decision, you're starting an app, where would you go to? Like, why would you choose Flutter over something like React Native?
It's a really good question. It's pretty hard to go into an in-depth analysis of which one is better and which one is worse. Both are excellent toolkits. Both have the backing of a very, very large organization. Both have been around for a while. Both are maturing. Both have big companies using them. The general feeling that I get from the Flutter community is overwhelmingly positive. Everybody that I speak to about Flutter, everybody that works with Flutter, everybody that I have contact with about Flutter, loves working with it, and they would choose to work with the toolkit because that's what they like working with. And that's the experience that I've had as well. It's about the sentiment behind what people think about the toolkit from what I've seen. And my personal experience with building apps has been that it's been very fast and very easy, low friction. I do hear that sometimes about React Native, but I also hear other stories about React Native, about sentiment where people are not as happy and they don't feel as though it's as tight a fit as Flutter. Flutter doesn't come with any of the baggage or doesn't try to tie together disparate things from the past. Dart was created as a clean language, and Flutter is a perfect fit for Dart, the language, and works very well together. And it feels as though you're using something that's a tight fit, something that's designed to work in that way. That's my feeling, and that's hard to quantify. But also the popularity of Flutter is growing, and I'll show a slide on that in a minute as well. Learning Flutter, this is another point. This is another reason why Flutter is great. It's very easy to learn, and there are plenty of resources to learn Flutter. The website itself has a learning section, and it's full of tutorials and code labs to get started on Flutter. One of the things that's really fantastic about Flutter right off the bat is there's several websites like Dartpad that allow you to just start working without installing Flutter anywhere. You can build a Flutter app inside the browser, a basic one, and just start coding right off the bat. You can get the UI coming up inside your browser and make changes and see them directly. So if you've never had any experience with Flutter, you can go to Dartpad right now, check out the sample, modify it, and see the results immediately without having to install anything. That's something that's a really big factor in learning and experimenting and trying out new things. It always helps me when I'm working through new problems.
Yeah, and then I just add to that, I can absolutely vouch for that. So I come from a position as a delivery lead on some bigger projects, and when I picked up Flutter, it took me about 6 months to get to a stage where I could start a company that delivered Flutter apps. And that's how fast you can actually learn working with Flutter and can produce stuff that's useful. So, and I was amazed with that. It's so easy to pick up. It's such a nice environment to work with.
I think 6 months is the the key number. Yeah. It's fast to learn. And if you have experience with Java, C#, TypeScript, anything like that, you're already going to have some of the understanding of Dart as a language to get started. It's very similar to a lot of other languages. It doesn't deviate too much from the other languages that are out there that people use, even Swift and things like that. It's got a lot of commonality with those things, so you're not going to find it a struggle to pick those up straight away. Besides that, there's plenty of YouTube courses. There's just endless numbers of YouTube courses and videos that you can watch. The Flutter team themselves produces a lot of great content. They give you bite-sized chunks on different widgets and UI components that you can use. That's really great. Udemy has several courses, and I'm sure you can find them on Pluralsight and other platforms right now.
Christian, so you were saying obviously a lot of reasons why companies should be using Flutter. If a company had a tech team that didn't know much about Flutter, Stefan, you mentioned 6 months there. You think that'd be the length of time to be able to skill up that team to be then proficient in developing on Flutter?
I completely agree with that. Yeah.
Is that how long it kind of took you to transition?
If you have a team of people that have built apps before that understand object-oriented programming roughly and the various sort of paradigms around that, then I think that it would be reasonable for anybody in a team to be able to pick up Flutter in about 6 months. I picked it up in about 6 months. Within 6 months, I could build an app with Flutter. I found it very easy to understand and pick up, and I think anybody would be able to transition if they were in Flutter every day. They'd be able to transition to Flutter within 6 months. The Flutter community is really massive. The places where Flutter has really taken off, places like India, Pakistan, but also Africa. There's a huge community of Flutter developers in Africa. And just recently, there was a conference in Nairobi, Kenya, just a couple of weeks ago. Google organised that conference, so the whole Flutter community flew to that event in Kenya, and that really shows that Google is getting behind moving the ecosystem out of the bubble that we live in. You know, the bubble that sort of originates in Silicon Valley and just reverberates around, you know, our area of understanding. There are many more people that are gaining access to the internet and laptops that are capable of doing development that are leveraging Flutter now, and they are going to make up the majority of people doing Flutter moving into future. There are going to be more Flutter developers in Melbourne soon, sure, but I suspect that there's going to be more demand for Flutter than there will be developers in Melbourne, because that's going to happen very quickly. I think there's going to be a lot of businesses jumping on Flutter over the next couple of years. And from what I'm seeing, there's more demand already for Flutter than there are developers. And that's the hot topic. That's what everybody wants to know. Does it work with AI? And absolutely it does. So OpenAI do a couple of different products. One of their products is ChatGPT. That's what everybody is, really excited about is ChatGPT. OpenAI also does a product, or the technology they use is linked to the product Copilot, which is built into GitHub. Probably a lot of people have used Copilot. I use it all the time. They're kind of linked technologies. Copilot is more targeted for developers. So it only does software development stuff, whereas ChatGPT does all kinds of language prediction, but it also does code. This is an example. I asked ChatGPT to create a sign-in page, and it gave me a sign-in page. So this is a sign-in page in Flutter. Quite often, it gets this right. Sometimes it doesn't. And what it can do more than anything is create the scaffolding of your app. So it's not necessarily going to create everything about your app. You can't click a button and say one app, please. It's not there yet. But the integration with the IDE, with Copilot and ChatGPT is getting better and better all the time. And I have a feeling that within the next couple of years, it will get to the point where you will explain the app in English and you will have a fully functional working app that basically is a starting point for your app when you move forward. That's not specific to Flutter, but I found that it works very well with Flutter. It has very good knowledge of Dart. It can do all kinds of things. It can review your code. It can write tests for your code. It can find bugs in your code. It's kind of limitless what you can do with this. So every day I'm learning new things about how to put it to work, find shortcuts for what I do. And I don't take it at face value because sometimes it hallucinates. Sometimes it makes mistakes. But the good thing is that the testing toolkit that comes with Flutter means that I put the tests in place, and then if ChatGPT or Copilot makes a mistake, quite often there's a backup mechanism to make sure that that doesn't introduce a bug into the system. Everything that I see about AI right now, there is absolutely no sign whatsoever that AI would take over humans' jobs. What I do see is that AI can easily make our job easier and cut down on time. There's just so many things that I find every day that just tends to make the job easier. Recently, I had to write a security script. It was in a language that I had never seen before. I'd set aside half my day to investigate it. I Googled it. I didn't get an answer straight away. I asked ChatGPT. It gave me the script instantly, and it worked. I tested it, and the script worked straight away. So that saved me an afternoon. And that's the kind of thing that I'm finding with Flutter apps. I can create that kind of scaffolding straight off the bat with ChatGPT, which also means less reliance on app templates. Because if you've used app templates, what you find is that it starts with a lot of boilerplate code right off the bat, stuff that you don't necessarily need, and you may spend days trying to remove that code later on, trying to remove all the stuff that it's created. Whereas this is very targeted. You can get a very good sort of code base right from the beginning. So it's very helpful, very helpful. So these are really my guesses about what I think the future of Flutter are about. I think there's kind of three key things that are important in the short-term future and the long-term future. I mentioned Impeller. That's going to be a key to making some of the apps, the more heavier animations smoother. That's in the works, and it should be available pretty soon for release. So moving into future, I think that this Impeller rendering engine is going to make Flutter apps even more beautiful, smooth, and we shouldn't see any kind of degradation of smoothness compared to native apps. In fact, we may actually see that they're even smoother than native apps. So it may end up in the long run that a Flutter app works in a way that's even more pleasing to the user's eyes than a native app. We may see that. So that's my hope for the long run. Oh, that's all right. I'll just go back over those two things. The two things that were on there were the Dart language. Google is dedicated to the Dart language itself. It's also a back-end language. You can use it to write code on the back end, and I actually like it as a back-end language as well. I use it for that kind of thing, writing code on the back end. That I believe that will be a focus for Google moving into future. But lastly, the big important one is web. One little anecdotal thing about the web that Google has signaled is, from my understanding, Google is also starting to treat the web a little bit differently in other areas as well. If you look at Google Docs is becoming more like a desktop application and moving away from the HTML DOM system that's been traditional in web browsers. I'm not sure if they've fully rolled it out in Google Docs, but over time they've been replacing the HTML DOM system, which is creating UI elements with HTML and CSS. They've slowly been moving towards a canvas-based approach. That means that the application itself renders the pixels without using the browser as the intermediary, without designing the UI elements as documents inside the browser. That's a pretty big move. That's moving away from the original design of browsers that are strictly HTML and CSS and moving to something different, which is something that's more like Flutter. Flutter renders using the same canvas kit. It draws the pixels inside the browser. So it takes control of the drawing, the rendering, inside the browser, and we'll probably use Impala in future. And it's taking the same approach as Google Docs. It's saying, at this point in time, we are seeing an advantage of rendering the UI ourselves rather than relying on the traditional HTML and CSS that come along with browsers. In my opinion, this is something that's going to be very useful for the future of web technology, browser technologies. And I think this is going to come to compete with HTML and CSS in the long run. And I think Flutter is going to be right there and well placed to leverage that technology moving into future. When we're talking about very rich web applications with full animations and things like, I'm not sure if they're planning on putting Rive Animation Studio inside the browser, but that's a possibility. We could see things like animation studios or video editing libraries and things like that inside the browser, because it doesn't need to depend on HTML and CSS anymore. Flutter could provide that kind of interoperability and that kind of rich UI experience moving into future. So I think web is a big one for Flutter moving into future. The one thing it doesn't do is SEO. So if you want your content to be searchable on Google, Flutter is probably not the best choice for that right now. It's not the best choice for Google to index your web page and index the content that you have and make it available through the web. That's something that Flutter is not amazing at right now. That will probably improve, but that's not the use case for Flutter. The use case for Flutter on the web is very, very rich applications that provide a rich user experience, probably for a captive audience, not so much the general casual browsers of the web. So I think this is the last slide, but I think this is one of the more important ones. I grabbed this statistic from Statista.com, and this is a chart that shows the popularity of the different toolkits at the moment. This is 2021, so they haven't got any statistics from the last couple of years. This is just 2021, but you could see the trajectory of Flutter from 2019 to 2021. It increased quite a bit over time. And at 2021, it was, according to Statista.com, it was already the most popular cross-platform toolkit. So, which was compared to, I think, 40 41% for React Native, or something like that. And React Native had trended downwards slightly over that time. So if we talk about the question of popularity, what do people want to use, Flutter is looking very bright. And I think if they did this again, if we see the statistics for 2022 or 2023, we're probably going to see more of a gap. So my belief in terms of popularity is that Flutter is on the rise. React Native may be plateauing in some way. It's not a popularity contest in terms of what is the right technology for the job, but I honestly believe that the fact that it's the right tool for the job in many, many cases, that people like using it, is what is driving the popularity behind Flutter. Google is not investing huge amounts of money in marketing Flutter. The technology kind of speaks for itself. They are doing a good job of building the technology, and the people who use that technology enjoy working with it. Okay, so the answer: investing in Flutter can reduce code maintenance costs. I've seen it. I'm sure that other teams will find the same thing if they work with Flutter.
And Christian, you were talking a lot there about the speed for developers developing on Flutter. You mentioned about the Octopus group app that you'd developed. I saw on LinkedIn that you had done another app recently.
Yeah.
How quick was that to develop? Yeah,
well, I had an idea for an app last Sunday. And I came up with the idea on the Sunday. I started fiddling on the Sunday. By about Wednesday, I put the app together. It's a simple newsfeed app for Flutter content. It's called Flutter Pulse. You can check it out on the Google Play Store. It took all of about 3 days to build that app and then submit it to the store. And it took 2 or 3 days to go through Google, and then it appeared. So that's the fastest I've ever produced an app from start to finish and put it through the Play Store. It's a fairly simple app, so I could have done it with other technologies, but again, the process was low friction. There was no fighting anything through the process. I asked myself the question, does Flutter have the tools to build this? I grabbed the various pieces that I needed, I put it together in the app. A few days later, the app is in the store. And that's the kind of experience that I've had with Flutter.
I was just wondering, the Flutter runs on the web, and one of the reasons why people use React Native is because you same code base across both, and obviously there's advantages to having Flutter across mobile and web. And I know they've been at it for a couple of years, but usually when I check in, it seems like it's kind of a bit of a work in progress, the web part of Flutter. So you work as a consultant on apps and stuff like that. Like, what do you normally tell people when they say, hey, I want the same code base to get across all three, like, Android, iOS, web? And like, is there certain decision, like questions you ask them to decide whether you would recommend a Flutter web thing?
Yeah. The first question is SEO. Do you need SEO? If you need SEO, I wouldn't go with Flutter. I would go with something else, because if you're building searchable content, then you want to present that to Google in a way that's very easy for them to consume. A Flutter app is not very easy for the Google search engine to crawl through. If you have a captive audience that's not about getting people to your website.
I assume it's like a logged in experience, if you know what I mean.
Like for a logged in experience, I have experimented quite a bit with the web, and I'm amazed at how good the apps look a lot of the time. And for me, I find it's great. I find the apps that come out are great. They look very much like the desktop version. They're not particularly hard to get them adaptive to different sizes and things like that. So I would probably recommend that a business experiments with it. But would I bet the future of that app on the business? depends on how much you need that app to be performant and perfect. If you have had success with React and your business depends on using React on the web, you wouldn't jump from that right away. But I certainly think that it's becoming an option. And if you're building something from scratch, if you've got the ability to experiment a little bit and a little bit of margin for error, then you should definitely try Flutter in that space.
It's actually an interesting thing you said about rendering into the canvas, and that's what Flutter's doing. I don't know, this is an obscure fact, but there's a thing called Silverlight. Some people may have heard of it, and that was Microsoft's first attempt to put .NET, all sort of .NET-like stuff on the web, and they did the same approach, right? They used a canvas and rendered into the canvas. And then this time, they've just recently-ish released something called Blazor, which is their, I'm saying it's their second, they've probably had 100, that I'm unaware of. But and people said, oh, hey, why don't you do that again? And they said, oh, well, no, we tried that with Silverlight. People didn't like it, so this time around we're doing CSS and HTML.
Yeah, they've rebuilt Silverlight on top of Blazor now.
Yeah, well, this is it, right? Because people are immediately asking for it. But I guess there is a little bit of a thing of like, there's a lot of standards and tools and stuff that expect CSS and HTML to be there. So anyway, we'll see how it goes.
I was a Silverlight developer for many years. Great platform. The real issue with Silverlight were the security holes that came along with it. So basically, in the long run, Microsoft was forced to abandon it because of the security holes. It wasn't because it wasn't a nice user experience. You could create really nice apps with Silverlight inside the browser. Flutter now offers the same kind of capability. You can write the code and you can look at the two apps on desktop and on web, and they will look pretty much exactly the same. You get the same kind of experience that you got with Silverlight.
I think we're nearly out of time, Christian, but Sean, you had a question, I believe.
I just want to say Flutter Web is not mature yet. So I think it's for internal use only, because sometimes when you load the Flutter Web, it's going to take quite a while. So if you use the Flutter Web, it's just like you are using mobile apps on a big screen. So I guess if you want to decide which technology you want to use, React Native or Flutter, you got to consider about the website. Most of the time, you got a React Native team. Also, you got a React team. They can share some code. For example, utilities, they check they validate the forms. They share the same code. In other case, maybe sometimes a team got a backend use Node.js, which is also based on maybe ES6. So that's a decision you have to make to choose React Native or Flutter.
That's all true. Some of the sentiment I've heard though is that in reality the code sharing between React and React Native is not as much as people would hope. That's what I've kind of come across. Whereas with Flutter, if the web app works well, you can run that on any other platform as well. So it depends. Mileage may vary depending on your situation.
Perfect. I think that's about it. So firstly, thank you very much, Christian. That was great. And thank you all for coming as well, guys. I know we've run a little bit over time there. If any of you do need to go off, please feel free. But if anybody wanted to stay, finish off the food and have a chat with Christine as well, please feel free. But thank you all for coming.
Cool. Have a great day.